Good morning. Some of you are awake at least, a little bit. It is great to be back with you this morning. I want to take this opportunity, since it is my last time on the podium, to say again, to express my profound appreciation to Travis and to Zach for the fantastic job and all of the help that has helped put this thing on, for the wonderful organization. It's without a doubt one of the greatest preterist seminars that has ever been held. So help me appreciate them again so very, very much. They have truly done a fantastic job on this. Now, I didn't have my timer set last night. So here, I'm going to see if I can do this. I'm technologically challenged, but I learned recently that my phone will actually keep time. So excuse me here. Well, give me a 1 hour count. Ha! How about that, sports fans? Okay. You know, I've already mentioned that at times in our studies and in our spiritual journey, we have what I call epiphany moments, or some call them Kodak moments. We read passages that we've read hundreds of times, perhaps thousands of times. We're studying subjects that are extremely familiar to us, and then all of a sudden, one day, it is as if the Lord snuck a verse in that wasn't there yesterday. And it reaches up and slaps us across the face, not like a 2x4, but like a 4x8. And we're going, wait a minute. Why haven't I ever seen this before? And it is both challenging and enlightening when that happens. And I have to tell you that many years ago, I was doing a study on the Great Tribulation. It is a subject that I had studied extensively, I thought, many, many times before, because in my earlier years, I had extensive interaction with dispensationals, individuals. My very first formal public debate was with a dispensational guy who happened to have a name Don. And so studying the Great Tribulation was something that I was very familiar with, again, or so I thought. And so one day I'm studying the subject of Great Tribulation, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, wait a minute. The passage that I am currently studying is also talking about the resurrection, in direct temporal connection with the Great Tribulation. I began to study other passages from the Old Testament especially that mention, they don't use the term Great Tribulation, but they certainly use the concept, the motif, and in that direct context, they mention resurrection. One of the things that was troubling to me is that their doctrine of the resurrection was not what I had always been taught it was, and that is biological bodies raising up out of the dirt. So this was challenging to me. Everything that I looked at was a challenge. I don't think I have to tell you that immediately following October the 7th and the horrible attack by Hamas, in which over 2,000 Jews were killed, the YouTube was absolutely alive with videos claiming, this is the Great Tribulation. This is it. This is proof positive that you and I are living in the last days. I cannot tell you the number of people down through the years that I have interacted with, many of whom, by the way, thank the good Lord, are now preterists, but who at the time were scared of life because they lived in constant fear of the next great political military crisis that they believed was going to bring on Armageddon, as we talked about last night, and the time of the end. But most of all, this great tribulation horror, in which 3/5 of the world's population is going to perish. Now, my purpose today is not to discuss the Great Tribulation per se. I covered that a little bit last night. I hope that I was able to share with you some information to demonstrate we're not waiting for the Great Tribulation. We're not waiting for the abomination of desolation. What I want to do today is to show you that what I said at the very beginning of the lesson is that there is a direct, inextricable, unbreakable bond between the doctrine of the Great Tribulation and the resurrection of the dead. And that when we look at that evidence, when we look at the biblical data, what we're forced to conclude is, number one, the resurrection is not what you and I have been taught it was. Not even close. Because the Old Testament doctrine of the resurrection, as taught in these prophetic passages, presents a view of resurrection that is challenging, to say the very least. And here's the point, part of the point, as we'll develop. Those Old Testament prophecies that talk about tribulation and resurrection, and the kind of resurrection that it talks about, are the very Old Testament passages that the New Testament writers draw on for their doctrine of the resurrection. So if the Old Testament doctrine of the resurrection is not what I was always taught that it was, and the New Testament writers are drawing directly on those Old Testament prophecies for their doctrine of the resurrection, maybe, just maybe, my doctrine of the resurrection that I thought was found in the New Testament isn't found there either. So my purpose is to examine the Great Tribulation as it relates to the biblical doctrine of the resurrection. Perhaps this will be challenging to you. I hope that it will be. I hope that it will be informative. The Great Tribulation and the resurrection, that interconnectivity, is one of the most ignored subjects in all of eschatology. Now that's starting to change, I would like to say, especially in the scholarly world. And here's a quote from Brent Petrie, who is one of my very favorite writers these days. In his book, Jesus, the Tribulation, and the End of Exile, he says this, quote, "According to the Old Testament, the resurrection itself would be preceded by a period of great tribulation. Per Daniel chapter 12, which is the most explicit prophecy of resurrection in the Hebrew books of the Old Testament. Strikingly, this description of the resurrection is preceded by the Great Tribulation." He is absolutely, undeniably true. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, "In that day there shall be great tribulation, such as has never been, nor ever yet shall be." Verse 2, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise." There's tribulation, there's resurrection. We'll have more to say about this as we proceed. But Brent Petrie is not alone in asserting and pointing out the connection between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. N.T. Wright says, quote, "The night would get darker and darker, and then the dawn would come. Israel's tribulations would reach their height, and then redemption would come." Do you see what he's saying? Great tribulation, redemption. The symbol of suffering was itself a key ingredient within Jewish expectation of the great deliverance, the great victory. In bringing Israel's destiny to its great moment, the story Jesus was telling would include, as part of its climax, the woes. The great tribulation that characterized Israel's vocation in, now catch the latter part of this, in bringing to birth the reign of her God. In the Jewish eschatological narrative, in their timeline, in writer after writer after writer, they point out that in the Jewish story, they had the coming of Elijah. They have the great tribulation. They have the coming of Messiah, the kingdom, and the resurrection. So in the Jewish story of eschatology, the Great Tribulation is part and parcel. It is fundamental, absolutely fundamental to their story. Without the Great Tribulation, the Jewish narrative did not have a place for the coming of the Lord in judgment and resurrection. There was no place for it. And guess what? We oftentimes talk about how Jesus differed with the Jewish expectation. Well, he did as to the nature of things, but not as to the narrative of things. Jesus believed in the exact same narrative. Jesus believed in what? The coming of Elijah. And he said, Elijah has already come. Matthew chapter 17, 10 to 12. I wrote a book on Elijah, which I absolutely love. That's not a promo. I'm just telling you. I believe that Elijah, i.e. John the Baptizer, other than Jesus and Paul, is the most significant eschatological figure in the New Testament. If you've never thought of him that way, I invite you to think about it. He is incredibly important. But in the Jewish narrative and in Jesus, Elijah was supposed to come before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, which is the day of the resurrection. So N.T. Wright brings out this relationship between the Great Tribulation and the eschatological consummation. Now, it's really interesting when you look at the commentators and you examine what they say in regard to the Great Tribulation and eschatology. Dispensationalism, interestingly enough, places a tremendous amount of emphasis on the Great Tribulation and Christ's parousia, therefore the resurrection. And what is really interesting to me, I didn't know this until I heard G.K. Beale say it in a lesson that I heard him give on one occasion. But Greg Beale, along with D.A. Carson, Herschel Hobbs, and some others, believed that the Great Tribulation began in A.D. 70, and that the Great Tribulation, listen carefully, is the entirety of the Christian age. I always thought the age of Messiah was an age of triumph and victory and glory. Well, no, not according to these men. Great Tribulation is the Christian age. To me, it's absolutely astounding that anyone would argue that, but Greg Beale says, quote, "It would seem that the tribulation Jesus has in mind in Matthew 24:21 must refer to the entire church age. And so, that means the abomination of desolation set up in the Jerusalem temple that would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem supposedly indicates that the Christian age is the Great Tribulation." And I don't know about you, but that just strikes me completely sideways. Now, what's interesting also is that most partial preterists, men that I'm sure you recognize their names, affirm that the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century and will never be repeated. Never be repeated. James Jordan, with whom I had a formal debate in Florida back in 2008 or somewhere along in there, one of the most fantastic debates I've ever had. After the debate, James Jordan just hugged me up. And he said, "That's one of the greatest experiences I've ever had." It's the only debate that anybody's ever done that. Anyway, James Jordan says, quote, "It is perverse," that's his word, "for commentators to continue to insist that the Great Tribulation is still in the future." That is in his work, The Handwriting on the Wall. Gary DeMar, that we were hoping would be here, and our prayers go out for him for certain, in the book Last Days Madness says, "The Great Tribulation was focused on Jerusalem and Judea, not the globe. It was focused on Jerusalem because they committed the greatest crime and the greatest sin ever." Kenneth Gentry says, "Copious, clear, and compelling evidence demonstrates that the Great Tribulation occurs in the first century," in his book, He Shall Have Dominion, 2009 copy. Now, it is really interesting, to say the very least, that the earliest church writers all associated, interestingly enough, as I say, the Great Tribulation with the time of the end and the parousia. There are even a few of the early church writers who believed that the Great Tribulation was in the first century. So we ask the question, okay, if you make the linkage that the Great Tribulation and the parousia go together, and if you believe the Great Tribulation was in the first century, then why aren't you saying that you're a full preterist? Makes sense, does it not? The earliest church writers, as I said, and by the way, this is documented in the book by Brian Daly, The Hope of the Early Church, and DeMar and Gummerlock, in their newest book on what the early church believed, document this as well. Now, I was raised in the amillennial view of eschatology. And in the amillennial world in which I was raised up, it was absolutely fundamental to say the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century in relationship and a connection to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, leading up to it consummating in. Among postmillennialists today, it is likewise taught, as I've already documented here among partial preterists, Great Tribulation was in the first century. I suggest to you that all of those who are saying, admitting and teaching that the Great Tribulation was in the first century, don't see the train coming or that horn blaring. And I suggest to you that maybe some of them are going to start changing their doctrine, like Mike was saying. Doug Wilson is all of a sudden backtracking on some of his admissions in regard to Revelation chapter 11, verse 14. So as I suggested to you last night, and I won't spend any more time on this, I hope that you caught that lesson last night, but the tribulation is past. Jesus said, when you, speaking to his apostles, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the one who reads understand, then let those in Judea flee. Verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation such as has never been, nor ever yet shall be. Mike did a great job in showing how that's common hyperbolic language. I think that was Mike who did that. So what we find, I won't go back over all this territory. So just to repeat my argument, the 144,000 of Revelation chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 14 came out of the Great Tribulation, Revelation chapter 7, 14. But the 144,000 were the first fruits of those redeemed to God from among men. They were the very first generation of Jewish Christians. Therefore, the very first generation of Jewish Christians experienced the Great Tribulation 2,000 years ago. Now, once again, this is so important. Most partial preterists agree with this assessment. I'm not drawing this out of thin air. This can be documented in their own writings. So let's go on. All Old Testament prophecies of the resurrection are inseparably linked to the Great Tribulation. And somebody may jump up and say, whoa, wait a minute. What about Job 19? I'm not going to discuss Job 19. Job 19:25 is not a prediction of the resurrection. At least certainly not in the traditional view of it, but nonetheless. But the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century at the time of the Jewish war. Therefore, the resurrection was to occur in the first century at the time of the Jewish war. So what this means is, unless our amillennial and postmillennial friends want to insert a dispensational gap of so far 2,000 years between the Great Tribulation of the first century and the parousia, which they place at the imaginary end of time, then they're being forced to conclude that the resurrection was in the first century. I cannot tell you how many amillennialists and postmillennialists that I have presented this to, and all I get is the deer in the headlight look. Or, well, that can't be true. Well, why can't it be true? You just admitted that the Great Tribulation was in the first century. It can be true. What can be false is our traditional view of the resurrection. Now, I want to drive this home very powerfully. Resurrection was the hope of Israel. Isaiah 25 through 27, Isaiah 59, Hosea 13, 14, Daniel 12, and Paul iterated this in Acts 24, Acts 26, Acts 28, etc., etc. Now, here's where we have to focus. Each of these promises was about the corporate restoration of Israel under the Messiah. Let me say this again. The resurrection was the hope of Israel, and every one of the passages that we're going to deal with today that deal with resurrection were promises of the corporate restoration of Israel from sin, death, from alienation from God. Not one of them has to do with biological resuscitation, raising of physical bodies out of the grave. If that's not challenging, I don't know what is. Let me quote Brent Petrie again in his book. Quote, this prophecy, that is the prophecy of Daniel chapter 12. Please catch the power of this. This prophecy of the resurrection and justification of the many, like all resurrection texts, is also a prophecy of the restoration of Israel. There are no Old Testament prophecies that are focused on, they include, but they are not focused on the raising of individual bodies out of the dirt. I mean, let's look at it like this. In order to have corporate, you've got to have individuals, right? Individuals make up the corporate. That's just the nature of the case. So let me reiterate, all of the prophecies, every one that we're going to look at today, were not promises of the raising of individual corporate bodies. So let us begin our journey. And we'll begin with Isaiah chapter 25, verses 1 to 9. I cannot take the time to read each one of these texts. I'll simply offer the constituent elements that are there. Verses 1 to 3, we have the destruction of a fortified city. Now, you need to read chapter 24 in order to really understand chapter 25, but I'm jumping in at 25 because of time constraints here. But in chapter 25, 1 to 3, the fortified city is turned over to foreigners. It is desolated, and the temple is turned over and turned into a temple of foreigners. That's the temple of Jerusalem being turned to foreigners. However, the Lord then promised in Isaiah 25 and verse 6 a great, what is known as messianic wedding banquet. This is a beautiful, beautiful doctrine in the Bible. We'll develop it slightly here in just a moment. It shall come to pass in that day. In what day? In which the fortified city will be made a ruin. The temple shall be turned over to foreigners. In that day the Lord shall make on this mountain. What mountain? Zion. And as I suggested to you, If you've never delved into the beauty and the power of the term Zion and eschatological expectation, you owe it to yourself to do so. On this mountain, the Lord shall make a great feast, a feast of wine on the lees. I've got to stand still. There's the camera. A feast of wine on the lees, a feast of fat things. Okay? Verse 8. In that day. In what day? In the day of the great messianic wedding banquet. The Lord shall destroy death. He shall remove the veil that is cast upon all of the nations. Now watch verse 9. In that day it shall be said, this is our God. He will save us. This is our God. We will wait for Him. So what do we have? We have the destruction of the city and the temple. Anybody have a problem with seeing that's the Great Tribulation? And it's tied directly to the messianic banquet. But the messianic banquet is tied absolutely, positively to what? The resurrection of Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. Now, in case you didn't know, but I suspect this audience does, Isaiah 25 and verse 8 is one of Paul's key Old Testament prophecies for his doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. Paul says, when this mortal shall put on immortality, when the corruptible shall put on incorruptibility, then shall be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. Isaiah 25, verse 8. So what is Isaiah predicting? He's talking about the restoration of Israel from sin death, alienation from God. Death, to be sure, but not biological death. So again, we have the destruction of the city and the temple, which is the Great Tribulation, tied directly to the Messianic banquet, the resurrection, and the salvation of Israel. So, as we've already seen, the tribulation was in the first century. But let's look at this doctrine of the Messianic banquet. I absolutely love this doctrine. It is beautiful. I hope you have your Bible and that you will spend time. Maybe not now, because if you take the time, I'm going to be so far past you, you won't catch up. But if you just take the time to read Isaiah chapter 65. Now here's what you need to know about Isaiah 65. Paul quotes from it twice, directly, verbatim, in Romans chapter 10 and verse 20 and following. And that lets us know that Paul believed that Isaiah 65, not just an isolated verse or two, but he believed the entirety of Isaiah 65 was referring to his day, his time, his generation, and his mission. But the Lord said of Israel, among other things, that Israel was going to fill up the measure of their sin. Your sins and the sins of your fathers will measure into your bosom, Isaiah 65, verse 6. And even as Loophole says in his commentary on the book of Isaiah, he said this is talking about Israel filling up the measure of their sins. So I didn't invent this idea. But in Isaiah chapter 65, as a result of predicting that Israel was going to fill up the measure of their sin, the Lord says in verse 11 and following, behold, my servant shall eat. I wonder if that's the messianic banquet. My servant shall drink. My servants, you shall be thirsty. My servant shall sing for joy of heart. You shall wail for sorrow of spirit. For behold, the Lord God will slay you, and you will all bow down to the slaughter. But behold, I create a new heaven and a new earth. I will call my people by a new name. What do we have? Destruction of Israel, great tribulation. But we have the new creation. Anybody have a problem with seeing the new creation and the resurrection as connected? I don't think you do. Now, in Matthew chapter 8, verse 11, Jesus is confronted by the centurion. And he says, Lord, my servant lies ill. And Jesus says, well, I'll come, I'll heal him. And the man says, no, you don't have to do that. Just speak the word and he will be healed. And Jesus is stunned. And he says, I have not found so great a faith, no, not in all of Israel. Your son is healed. Your servant is healed. And verily I say unto you, many shall come from the east and the west and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom. Folks, this is messianic banquet. This is Isaiah 25. This is Isaiah 65. What would happen at the time of those coming from the east and the west, sitting down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom. And he said it would happen in the day when the sons of the kingdom are cast out into outer darkness. Do you suppose the sons of the kingdom being cast out has anything whatsoever to do with the Great Tribulation? Well, according to Luke chapter 13, 28 and following, that's precisely what it has to do with. Jesus said, in the day in which I'm going to say to you, I don't know you. You're going to say to me, Lord, when did we ever see you? And he says, I taught in your streets. I was there with you. And you did not believe me, you did not obey me. Therefore, you yourselves will be cast out. That's Israel being cast out. So what we have here, and by the way, this is agreed to, Gary DeMar does, Jordan, Gentry, Matheson, they all agree that what we're talking about here is the time of the resurrection. Now, this is stunning to me, folks. Okay, if you're going to agree that Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 is the time of the resurrection based upon Isaiah chapter 25, which is a very, very, very clear connection, then that means that Isaiah was predicting, and Jesus was stating, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would be resurrected to sit at the messianic banquet. I mean, how else are you going to get there? Because it's in the kingdom. The kingdom and resurrection are synchronous ideas, synonymous ideas. Okay, follow me here. DeMar, Gentry, Jordan, they say, we're all in the kingdom today, sitting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom. Well, the only way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob could ever sit down at the banquet is to be resurrected. And I don't know about you, but I am fairly certain that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were never raised out of the dirt to sit at any kind of a literal, physical banquet. Doesn't that challenge our traditional concept of resurrection in a powerful, powerful way? So, if they are at the table, as many postmillennialists affirm, then the resurrection is fulfilled. But to reiterate and to reemphasize, they were patently not raised out of the dirt. Now, what we find then is Isaiah 25 and Isaiah 65 and Matthew chapter 8 all posit that resurrection at the destruction of Israel, the Great Tribulation, when, quote, the sons of the kingdom would be cast out. So Old Covenant Israel, guess what? Paul said Old Covenant Israel was about to be cast out in Galatians chapter 4 for persecuting the New Covenant seed of Abraham, the children of faith, the children of the Spirit. Okay, Isaiah chapter 26 is our next passage. What time did we start? Okay. Okay, Isaiah chapter 26. This is one of those incredible passages. This is one of those epiphany moments for me when I started reading it and analyzing it and doing an exegesis on it. Verse 14. I want you to notice the corporate emphasis here. Isaiah says, Yahweh says through him, the wicked nations are not going to rise. And he speaks of the corporate, the nations as corporate entities. And he says, they are dead. They will not live. They're deceased. They will not live. Or will not rise, excuse me. Okay, if the discussion is resurrection and we're talking about nations as a whole, the Lord says of the wicked nations, they're not going to rise. Well, that's kind of upsetting to the traditional view of resurrection itself, is it not? Verse 16 to 18. Here we find, and by the way, there's broad consensus on this in scholarship. Lord, in trouble, they, that is the nations, have visited you. They poured out this is Israel praying to God. They poured out a prayer when your chastening was upon them. What's their chastening? Great tribulation. As a woman with child is in pain and cries out in her pangs. How did Jesus describe tribulation in Matthew chapter 24, verse 8? These are the beginning of the birth pangs. And that was the famine, earthquake, etc., etc., etc. Now watch this. In verse 19, your dead shall live. Now there's some translational issues here. Some say, together with my dead body, That's some rendered as singular, others rendered as bodies. I don't have a problem with either one. It's just like I said a few moments ago, you don't have corporate unless you got individual. There's no way to have corporate without individual. Christ is the Savior of the body. Well, what's the body comprised of? You and me. Us. Verse 21, notice this particularly. In this day of the resurrection, this day of rising out of the dust, is the day in which the Lord would come out of heaven, walk on the tops of the mountains would be melted under his feet, and in that day the earth shall no longer conceal its blood. This is the day. Meredith Kline, if you're familiar with him, fantastic scholar, Meredith Kline wrote an article on Isaiah chapter 26 and the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. It's one of those articles that when you read it, you go, yeah. Wait a minute, where did you go? He completely abandons his hermeneutic and doesn't even connect the avenging of the martyrs with Matthew chapter 23. And my question is, how in the world do you do that? So, Isaiah chapter 26, once again, just like Isaiah 25, the emphasis is on the corporate body of Israel, in sin, death, alienated from God. Let's go on. Isaiah chapter 27, and verses 7 to 8. Has he, this is a difficult text to read. You got to follow along with the pronouns. Has he, Yahweh, struck Israel as he, Yahweh, struck those who struck him, the nations who struck Israel? Or has he been slain, that has Israel been slain, according to the slaughter of those who were slain by him? You follow all that slaying and dying and what have you? Now notice he says, after asking, has Israel been slain? And he says, yes, in part. How do you in part kill somebody, an individual? Kind of tough, isn't it? But look at verse 9. So here in verse 7 and 8, we have the death of Israel. Verse 9, by this, by what? And by the way, the answer to that rhetorical question was yes, he killed Israel. How? By sending her away. That was the corporate death of Israel, being sent into Assyrian captivity. Many commentators have taken note of the fact that in the mentality of Israel, to be separated from the land, from the city, the temple, the priesthood, and the sacrifices, what is itself considered to be death. To be restored to the land, to be restored to the fellowship of God mostly, and the very epitome of that to the Israelite was to be restored to the land. We'll investigate this more as we go along here. But I hope you see how death is being used by the biblical writer. These writers are not focused on individual biological death. They're focused on Israel in her relationship with, or lack thereof, with Yahweh. So look at verse 10, Isaiah 27, verse 10. After saying in verse 9, therefore by this the iniquity of Jacob will be covered. By the way, this is quoted verbatim by Paul in Romans chapter 11, 26 and 27, that spoke of Israel's salvation coming at the coming of the Lord out of Zion. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. But Romans chapter 11 is also talking about resurrection. Resurrection of Israel. If the casting away of Israel be the riches of the Gentiles, then how much more shall their, Israel's, acceptance be but life from the dead? To be restored to God, in fellowship with God, was life from the dead. So to continue, chapter 27, verse 10. All of this would take place, that is, the taking away of their sin would take place, when he makes all the stones of the altar like chalk stones beaten to dust. When the fortified city would be desolate, therefore the one who made them will not have mercy on them. Now this is taken directly from Deuteronomy 32, verse 28. When the Lord 3 times in that chapter talks about Israel's last days, her latter end. And in that last end, God was going to judge Israel because they were a nation of no understanding. Mike did a great job of pointing out Matthew chapter 17, verse 17, a direct citation of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 28 and following. So here's Jesus applying the Song of Moses to his generation. Now we have, in Romans chapter 11, Paul quoting from the same chapter, the same kind of a context, and again relying on Deuteronomy chapter 32. This judgment of Isaiah 27 was going to be the judgment on the people whom the Lord had created because of their refusal to hear the message of the prophets, to hear the voice of the Lord. Now, what do we have here? We have the sin of Israel, the death of Israel through being carried off into captivity. But then we have the promise of the taking away of Israel's sin. When would that be? When the altar would be turned to chalkstone, when the fortified city would be destroyed, when the women would go out to gather food and could find none, and on and on. But then comes the good news. Isaiah chapter 27, verse 12 and 13. It shall come to pass in that day. What day? The day of the taking away of Israel's sin. The day of raising her from her death. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will thresh from the channel of the river to the rook of Egypt, and you shall be gathered. Now this is, the word gathered there is from the Greek word episunagoge. An incredibly important word, eschatological word, for the end time gathering, the end time resurrection. But wait a minute, this is gathering Israel from the nations to which they've been scattered. This is resurrection language. And they shall come who are about to perish in the land of Assyria, and they who are outcast in the land of Egypt, and they shall worship the Lord in the holy mount of Jerusalem. What is that holy mount of Jerusalem? It's Zion. Remember Hebrews 12? You have come to Mount Zion. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. So we find in Isaiah chapter 27 that Israel was alienated. They were dead in exile, but they were not physically dead. And we find the sounding of the great trumpet. This is where it gets really, really good. Because in verse 13, this regathering, this episunagoge, would be at the sounding of the great trumpet to gather those who are in Egypt and Pathros and Cush and the lands of Assyria and what have you, and they shall be gathered. They're being brought out of death. Now remember, that's at the sounding of the great trumpet. Well, in Matthew chapter 24, in a passage that the huge majority of our millennialists and postmillennialists as well agree is talking about AD 70. At that time, the Son of Man will send forth his angels with the sound of the great trumpet. And they shall gather together the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Virtually all scholars today that I'm aware of agree Jesus is drawing directly from Isaiah chapter 27. Well, you know what that means? That means that Matthew chapter 27 or 24, verse 31 is a prediction of the resurrection. So for all of those folks who say, well, Matthew chapter 24, 4 to 34, that all refer to the first century, the time of the fall of Jerusalem, the judgment of Jerusalem. Yeah, AD 70. Oh, wait a minute. Verse 31 is prediction of the resurrection. So you just admitted that the resurrection is predicted in the very verses that you agree predicted the events of the first century. So, what we find in Isaiah 27 is what we found in Isaiah 25, what we found in Isaiah chapter 26. We have alienation, which equaled death. We have the tribulation as a result of that alienation, that sin. But we find reconciliation, which is resurrection. I believe that we can look at this in an extremely simple way. Sin brought alienation and death. Forgiveness would bring reconciliation and resurrection. That's as simply as I know how to express it. And I think it's found everywhere. Okay, I'm going to have to hurry here. Jeremiah chapter 30 is another incredible passage about the great tribulation and resurrection as well. I will take the time to read this. We have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Ask now and see whether a man is ever in labor with child. Do you remember the former text that we read about the birth pangs? Birth pangs of Messiah? Here we find it again. It's very common. Okay. All faces are turned pale. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is the time of Jacob's trouble. But he shall be saved out of it, for it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from your neck, I will burst your bonds, foreigners shall no more enslave them. But they shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. This is messianic prophecy of the time in the last days in which Messiah would come, and Israel would go through a period of the great tribulation, nothing like it ever. But he said, I'm going to deliver you out of it. Well, does that mean that Israel would not in fact go through it? No, it means that the remnant would not. I don't have time to develop that extensively, but that's basically what it means. Notice what the Lord closes this text with. Though I make a full end of all the nations where I have scattered you, yet I will not make a complete end of you. Why? Well, because in all these prophecies of the scattering of Israel into the nations, the Lord made a promise that what he would do is save a righteous remnant of Israel out from among the nations. And that's key to understanding. Just like Isaiah chapter 10, verses 20 and following, the Lord said, or Israel said, except the Lord of Sabaoth had given us a remnant, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah. Yet the Lord has given us a remnant. Well, let's look closer at Jeremiah chapter 30. Number one, it would be a time of unprecedented trouble on Israel. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is the time of Jacob's trouble. Number two, it is a time of deliverance. He shall be saved out of it. Now wait, this is Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Then shall be time of great tribulation, such as has never been, nor ever yet shall be. But Michael shall stand up for his people, and those written in the book shall be delivered. When? At the time of the resurrection. And the redeemed, here in Jeremiah chapter 30, would serve David their king. So we have here, as I've already suggested, the salvation of the remnant. Though I make a full end of all the nations where I have scattered you, yet I will not make a full end of you. Then we come to Hosea chapter 13. In Hosea chapter 13, and in April of this year, I had a debate, very scholarly fellow by the name of Chris Date. Any of you watched that by any chance? Oh, yeah, good. Prior to the debate, I asked him a written question. Is Paul's doctrine of death and resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 the same death and resurrection that Hosea predicted in Hosea chapter 13? And he said, yes. And my response to that was, in the privacy of my office, thank you very much. Why? Well, Paul's doctrine of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the doctrine of the resurrection found in Hosea chapter 13. If they're not the same, why did Paul quote it? And say, when the resurrection takes place, Hosea will be fulfilled. Then shall be brought to pass the saying. All right? So what do we find in Hosea chapter 13? Verses 1 and 2, we have death, and we have the death that is specifically defined. When Ephraim spoke trembling, that is, humbly before the Lord, he exalted himself in Israel. But when he, Ephraim, that's the northern tribes, when he offended through Baal worship, he died. Sin, death. Just like in the garden. In the day you eat, you will surely die. They didn't die physically that day, but they were alienated from God that day. But watch this. When he sinned, he died, yet he sinned more and more. I wonder how many people keep sinning after they die biologically. That raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it? Verse 12. The iniquity of Ephraim is bound up, his sin is stored up. The sorrows of a woman in childbirth shall come upon him. Remember this motif from the earlier verses? I will ransom them from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. O death, I will be your plagues. O grave, I will be your destruction. So, the death to be overcome was not biological death. It was sin death. It was covenantal death. It was loss of fellowship with God. This is a purely Hebraic concept. If you are alienated and separated from the presence of God, you are dead. Now remember, the tribulation comes immediately before the resurrection. The tribulation was in the first century, as we've already seen. Therefore, the resurrection was in the first century. Now look at Daniel chapter 9. I wrote a book, 70 Weeks Are Determined Upon for the Resurrection. I didn't see this for years and years and years. And then it was one of those, boom, slap me upside the head. Yeah, this is exactly what this is talking about. Daniel 9 confined the taking away of Israel's sins to 70 weeks. What did Paul refer to the taking away of Israel's sin as? Resurrection. The taking away of Israel's sin is posited at Christ's parousia and Israel's resurrection, as I've already shown. But Daniel 9, 26 and 27, what does it have? It has the abomination of desolation. Therefore, it has the great tribulation. And then it has the taking away of sin, the making of atonement, and then it has what? The bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Folks, that's 2 Peter 3. That's the new creation. How did we get into the new creation? Resurrection. Revelation chapter 20, 10 and following. You don't get into the new creation without resurrection. Therefore, Israel's salvation and resurrection of Romans chapter 11 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, because remember, to go back to Hosea, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be the resurrection in fulfillment of Hosea chapter 13. The deliverance from that death through resurrection. But the death of Hosea was not physical death. It was alienation from God, separation from God. Therefore, the resurrection would be being raised out of alienation from God. I'm going to have to hurry here. So, what do we have once again, looking a little bit closer at Daniel chapter 9? In both the Jewish narrative and in Jesus, there is a direct, inseparable connection between the abomination, the great tribulation, the parousia, and the resurrection. Once again, the abomination of desolation, as I pointed out to you last night, would be a heinous crime committed by Israel that would bring about her desolation. But the abomination and thus the tribulation are confined to the 70 weeks of Daniel. The 70 weeks ended no later than AD 70. Therefore, the resurrection had to occur no later than AD 70. So let's look at Daniel chapter 12 now. Boy, it's remarkable what some people are trying to do to escape the force of this text. I mean, it's literally shameful. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, at that time there shall be great tribulation such as never been. Oh, that's the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. Oh, that's the end of time. And these people supposedly don't believe in the dispensational gap doctrine. Really? You just inserted a 2,500-year gap in the period at the end of Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. And yet when I've confronted them with their gap doctrine, which is just, excuse me, full of holes, they say, oh, no, I don't believe in gaps. Well, then stop using one. Stop inserting one into the text if you say you don't believe in that. So, I'm going to take the time to do this because this is important. We're told in Daniel chapter 12 it would be a time of great tribulation such as has never been, right? Okay? Well, we're told that the Christian age is the great tribulation, but Jesus said, and Luke's version of it is, that tribulation would be the greatest thing that had never been anything like it, nor ever would be ever. So if what Jesus was predicting that had to do with the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 was the worst that would ever be and nothing would ever match it, then you can't say that the Christian age is that tribulation. It doesn't even make good nonsense to say that. So the point of fact is this. Josephus said Jerusalem had been taken 5 times. He said there were only 2 desolations of the city. One, 586 BC at the hand of the Chaldeans. Number 2 in 70 AD. So if you're going to make the claim that Daniel chapter 12 verse 1, then shall be great tribulation, is the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, you're contradicting what Josephus said, and as a good faithful Jew, I think he probably knew more about the great tribulation than you do. And by the way, the tribulation of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes was bad. I don't in any way disparage it or disvalue it. Jerusalem was not destroyed. The temple was not destroyed. In either BC 586 or, under Antiochus Epiphanes. The temple was not destroyed. It was desecrated, but desecrated is not destroyed. So you're going to tell me that the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, that on a scale of destruction, didn't even begin to approach that of that under the Babylonians, or the time of AD 70. You're going to try to tell me that Antiochus's attack and desecration of the temple was worse than either one of those? Then you're violating history and text. But I got to go on. Okay, verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Well, in verse 4, when would all of this take place? At the appointed time of the end. The Suntelia tu Kairu. Well, guess what we have? Verse 3. It's the rewarding of the dead and of the prophets. That's verse 13 especially. Daniel, go your way. You shall sleep with your fathers until the time of the end, when you shall arise to receive your inheritance. When would all this take place? Well, one angel asked another, as a matter of fact. And I love it when biblical figures ask a question and heaven gives the answer, don't you? One angel asked another, when shall these things be? What shall there be fulfillment of all of these things? And the other angel lifts his right hand and left hand and swears by him who lives forever and ever, and says it shall be a time and a half time, and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all, not some of it, not a little bit of it, not a few items, but when all of these things are fulfilled. Well, what are all of the things, the antecedent things? Oh, great tribulation, resurrection, end of the age, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom of their God. Oh, and leading many to righteousness. All of those things will be fulfilled when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. Now, what I find interesting is men like N.D. Wright says Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is all about the avenging of the martyrs. I like that personally, because that segues beautifully with Matthew chapter 23. Okay, so what we have in Daniel chapter 12, we have tribulation, the resurrection at the appointed time of the end, and the first century was the appointed time of the end. So when we come to the New Testament and we examine the doctrine of the tribulation and the resurrection, what do we find? What we find is that in every single one of the Old Testament texts that we have examined, their texts of the resurrection prophecies, they are inseparably bound up to the time of the Great Tribulation. Great Tribulation, resurrection, bound up. So as I've already emphasized, the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century in direct context with the fall of Jerusalem. Therefore, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, which is based upon all of these Old Testament prophecies that included the Great Tribulation and connected the Great Tribulation with the resurrection, and the resurrection was not about biological bodies, that means that 1 Corinthians 15 is not about biological bodies. Now, is it about body? Yes, it is. The question is, what body? What was it in the Old Testament, in all of the resurrection passages? Now, I'm going to have to hurry to get to what I want to get to. Yeah, I'm going to have to hurry here. Was that 10:45? Oh, I'm good. Okay. So in each of the texts, let me reiterate this because this is important. In each of the texts that we have examined, they posit the resurrection in the context of the judgment of Jerusalem. Everybody follow me? I hope you follow that. Well, in Matthew chapter 24 and 21, Jesus said, then when? At the time of the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation was supposed to be set up in Judea. It wasn't going to be set up in Arabia or in New York City or in Los Angeles or San Francisco. It's supposed to be set up in Judea. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let those who are in Judea flee. Now, let me ask you a question. If the Great Tribulation is the entirety of the Christian age, how can anybody flee the Great Tribulation? Isn't the Christian age worldwide? Is it not everywhere? You can't escape the Great Tribulation set up by the abomination of desolation. It's impossible. So, once again, notice that Jesus said this tribulation would be such as never ever shall be. Not until the end of time. Jesus didn't say there shall be great tribulation, such as shall be until the end of time. Doesn't even approach it. So this excludes another great tribulation beyond the first century. Well, if there's not another great tribulation beyond the first century, guess what? There's not another resurrection for the salvation of Israel beyond the first century. As seen, partial preterists posit the great tribulation in the first century and not beyond. But the tribulation is inseparably connected to the resurrection in text after text after text that we have examined. So here's what this means. It means that when Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31, immediately after the tribulation of those days. What days? Those days in which the abomination will be set up in Judea, and they could flee Judea to escape the great tribulation. That means that the parousia of Christ had to have occurred in that generation immediately after the tribulation. Mark and Luke all agree with this assessment. So once again, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. They will see the Son of Man coming. He shall send forth his angels with the sound of the great trumpet to gather together. Episynagoge, by the way, the very word used by Isaiah 27, verse 12. This is the eschatological resurrection. And Jesus emphatically posited that in his generation, verse 34. Once again, to drive this point home, Matthew 24:31 is a direct echo of Isaiah chapter 27, verse 12 and 13. And by the way, Jewish rabbis understood Isaiah 27:13, 12 and 13 as the time of the end. They didn't see it as some interim action of God. This was the time of the resurrection. So I got to go on. Now, we need to talk about the nature of the resurrection, because you've heard me saying here, well, this is all about the restoration of Israel from sin death, from alienation, separation from God. That's exactly what it was. Dispensationalists might listen to the very first part of this lesson and say, oh, well, see, Preston's talking about a national corporate body resurrection of Israel out of bondage. Boy, look at what happened in 1948. Wrong. It's not what I'm suggesting. The promise of the physical return, which happened after the Babylonian captivity, Ezra and Nehemiah, just read them. Was that on a grand scale? Not as hoped. I agree with that, but it was still a return from Babylonian and Assyrian captivity. But that return pointed to a greater spiritual reality. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, and I have people tell me all the time, well, I believe that the events of AD 70 were typological. I wrote a book in response to that entitled AD 70, a type or a shadow of the real end, ? And I adduced 15 reasons why AD 70 is not a type or a shadow of the real end, some end of time. But Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6 and verse 11, as he rehearses Israel's history of sinning, being alienated, being exiled, and giving warnings to his generation. And he did that because, you see, they were in the second Exodus at that time. But Paul says those things happened unto them, and unfortunately, many translations say, well, they were examples for us. That's not a good translation. The Greek of the text is they are literally types of us. Now, if AD 70 was a type of something else, we ought to have some text that says we are types of that which is coming. We don't have it. Everything pointed to the climax in the first century. So the regathering was to be an episynagoge. Now, consider the nature of the episynagoge. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, Jesus, lamenting over Jerusalem, said, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent unto thee, how often I would have gathered you together. Now, what was Messiah to do when he came? He's supposed to episynagoge Israel. He's supposed to gather them to himself. And they're supposed to come from the east and the west, etc., etc. Well, here's Jesus saying, I would have episynagogued you. Does anybody know of a single Bible verse in which Jesus told his apostles or the crowds following him, now I want you to know, everybody, on a given date, I want everybody to return to Jerusalem. I want everybody to be there. Because we're going to have a physical regathering. Now, I want you to send people out. I want you to go to Samaria. I want you to go to Rome. I want you to go to Carthage. I want you to go everywhere and gather every Jew you can find and bring them back to the physical land of Israel. Nope. What did Jesus mean when he said, I would have gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks? He was talking about a covenantal gathering, wasn't he? To gather them into fellowship with him, to gather them into the presence of God. But he said, you would not. But you know what he's saying in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31? Okay, you rejected it. The gospel is going to go into all the world as a witness to the nations, then comes the end. And what's going to happen to the end? The Lord's going to gather. He's going to truly gather the obedient. And they're going to comprise his new synagogue. His new, as Robert so eloquently stated it, his new temple. What's the nature of the gathering? Therefore, what is the nature of the resurrection? It's not biological. It's not even physical. It is a spiritual gathering. It is a spiritual resurrection of those alienated from God being brought into fellowship with him through forgiveness. Now, the gathering, the episynagoge, would be to Zion. Psalms 102 makes this perfectly clear. Isaiah 25, Isaiah 26, Isaiah 27, which we said, they're going to come and they're going to gather and they're going to worship on this mountain. A passage that I've appealed to several times already, Hebrews chapter 12. Oh, pshaw. What do I do, Zach? You tell me. Okay, thank you so much. So the gathering was going to be to Zion. Hebrews chapter 12. You have come to Mount Zion. And as I stated earlier, folks, if you don't catch the power of that particular statement, as it would have resonated with the first century Jews who were hoping for Messiah to come, the Messiah to come and redeem them from their sin, the Messiah to bring them and restore them to the presence of God, to build the messianic temple. If you fail to see that, you're missing such an incredibly powerful, beautiful, and wonderful message. You have come to Mount Zion. You have come to the resurrection, is what that means. Well, the resurrection of the messianic banquet would be on Zion, and it would be when the sons of the kingdom would be cast out. Was the Lord promising, as Papias, one of the very, very early apostolic writers said, well, you know, when the Lord comes, we're going to have a banquet, and they're going to be literal grapes, 12 feet tall. Grapevines, or grape clusters, 12 feet long. See, that's what happens when you start over-literalizing the Scripture. And then we find the resurrection. The gathering would be when God would no longer have mercy on the people he created, Deuteronomy 32:28. And it would be the destruction of the old covenant body. The nation, the body. But it would be the resurrection of the righteous remnant, joining with the Gentiles to create one new man. Thus, as with types, the physical pointed to the spiritual. Forgiveness and acceptance would be life from the dead. So let me summarize and conclude. Hopefully this is not too long for you. I believe I've established the following. There is a direct, inseparable, unbreakable link between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. Number two, each of the Old Testament prophecies that we examined foretold the corporate resurrection of Israel out of sin, death, back to fellowship with God. That was going to happen under the Messiah. It was not going to be a restoration that they anticipated at all. Jesus was more than clear on that over and over and over again when they wanted the restoration of a literal nationalistic quasi-military kingdom, and Jesus said, hey guys, I don't want anything to do with this. John chapter 6 and verse 15. So we have seen that sin brought alienation, which brought exile, which was death, but forgiveness brought reconciliation, which was resurrection. That's why Paul could even say to Gentiles who were never under covenant, who never broke that covenant, but who sinned nonetheless, and therefore were dead in their sins and trespasses, Ephesians chapter 2, Colossians chapter 2 and verse 13, that when they came into Christ, what? They were raised from the dead. So we have shown that partial preterist admissions about the time of the fulfillment of Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks, their admissions concerning the time of the Great Tribulation, are absolutely fatal to the partial preterist view, because they're basically admitting that the resurrection had to have been in the first century. And thus, all of these admissions absolutely confirm the truth of covenant eschatology. I will stop right there. Thank you very much.